This is not who we thought they were. In every familiar story, there is someone we may have stopped seeing, and grace we may have missed. Today, we return to the beginning and take another look at Eve.
You know, when you look at a famous painting, let's say the Mona Lisa, it's almost impossible to actually see the painting anymore.
Oh, absolutely. You just see the postcards.
Right. The postcards, the parodies, centuries of hype and pop culture surrounding it. You're looking at the cultural baggage, not the canvas.
Yeah, the narrative just becomes a caricature at that point.
Exactly. And that is exactly what happens with familiar stories, especially ancient ones. You hear a name and your brain instantly fills in like 1,000 assumptions before you even read a single word of the actual text.
People stop seeing the nuance because they think they already know the ending.
Right.
We end up trading the actual textured details of a historical or literary text for a very flat, two-dimensional summary.
And that usually misses the point entirely. So welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, our mission is to peel back those layers on arguably the most famous story ever told.
Which is definitely a story with a lot of baggage.
So much baggage. We are unpacking a stack of sources from a series called Not Who We Thought They Were, and we're specifically focusing on the story of Eve in the biblical book of Genesis.
Right.
Now, to be clear right up front, we are not here to take a theological side or endorse a specific religious viewpoint.
Yeah.
If there's politically charged content or religious dogma in these sources, we are totally neutral.
We're just looking at what the sources say.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on the content provided to just convey the ideas they present. The goal here isn't a sermon. It's an investigation into the anatomy of deception, the psychology of human failure, and honestly, how to read familiar ancient texts with a little more honesty and mercy.
Which is incredibly necessary for a text like Genesis.
So, okay, let's unpack this, because if we want to understand the true trajectory of this text without feeling, totally overwhelmed, we have to clear away centuries of assumptions.
Right, and my approach here is to look exclusively at the exact text. We need to distinguish between what is actually on the page versus the cultural baggage we often attach to it.
Because it completely shifts the framework, doesn't it?
It really does. When you look closely at the mechanics of the story, how the characters speak, the specific words they use, the sequence of events, you realize we are looking at a narrative that asks profound psychological questions about trust, boundaries, and consequences.
And to understand the ending of this famous story, which, most of you probably think we actually must first look at how the deception really began.
Because it doesn't start where people usually assume it does.
Right. It doesn't start with a sudden temptation. It starts with an environment of total, overwhelming abundance.
Yeah, so in Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, the text outlines a command given to the man, and the order of that command is critical to understanding everything that follows.
The order is what struck me the most in the sources.
It's vital. First, the text says they may freely eat from every tree in the garden. So the baseline is staggering generosity.
Yeah.
The entire environment is a gift. It is only after establishing that massive provision that a single boundary is introduced, which is one specific tree they cannot eat from.
Generosity first. The whole world is basically theirs. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet of unimaginable variety with just one tiny asterisk.
Exactly. But then we get to Genesis chapter 3. The serpent enters the narrative.
And he doesn't give some grand, evil villain monologue. Right?
No, he doesn't threaten them at all. He just asks a question. Genesis 3, verse 1 says, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?"
What's fascinating here is this sheer subtlety of that psychological shift.
It's brilliant in a dark way. The serpent takes a landscape of total abundance and verbally reframes it into a narrative of absolute restriction.
It's totally twisted.
Right. The original parameter was that you could eat from every tree but one. The serpent twists it to suggest a sweeping prohibition, that everything is forbidden.
It turns a boundary meant for protection into a feeling of deprivation.
Exactly. Deception, especially in this text, doesn't begin with an outright aggressive rejection of authority. It starts with a quiet, planted suspicion about the authority's heart.
Yeah, it forces the listener to ask, is this boundary protecting me, or is someone holding something better back for me?
Which is a very human doubt.
It is such a recognizable psychological tactic. It's like having a great job with full benefits, an amazing salary, a corner office, and then a toxic coworker sidles up and whispers to you, yeah, the salary is nice, but why won't the boss give you the keys to the supply closet? They must be intimidated by your potential.
That is a perfect modern equivalent.
Right. Suddenly, you completely forget the great salary, the health benefits, the amazing office. You obsess over the supply closet. You feel entirely deprived, even though you have basically everything.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism at play, because once that picture takes hold, the idea of a boss or a creator who cannot be trusted and is secretly afraid of what you might become, well, the forbidden object begins to look entirely different.
It changes the whole perspective.
It does. In Genesis 3, verses 4 and 5, the serpent moves from questioning the command to outright denying the consequences. The text says, "You will not surely die."
Wow.
And then the motive is attacked. He said, God knows your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. So the serpent is offering a completely different, much darker picture of the creator's intentions.
And I want to look at how the woman responds to that first question, because something really stood out to me in the sources.
Oh, the phrasing she uses.
Yeah. In Genesis 3, verses 2 and 3, she repeats the rule back to the serpent. She says they must not eat the fruit or touch it lest they die. Wait, or touch it.
Yeah.
I don't remember that being in the original command back in chapter 2. Like, did I miss something?
You didn't miss anything. You caught a crucial anomaly in the text. Or touch it was not in the original command.
So where did she get it?
Well, the text doesn't explicitly state where she got that extra harsher rule. However, the sources point out she is operating on borrowed words.
Borrowed words, meaning she didn't hear it directly.
Right. She is restating something that was originally told to the man before she was created, and now another voice is stepping in to reinterpret it for her. It highlights a deeply human vulnerability.
Which is what?
How fragile our understanding is when we operate on secondhand knowledge.
Oh man, that makes so much sense. If you only know a rule because someone else passed it down to you, like a game of telephone, it's a lot easier for a third party to come along and make you doubt it.
Absolutely. The source text uses this to mirror how uncomfortable it feels when people learn about big concepts, like faith or philosophy or ethics, entirely from someone else, like a parent or a teacher.
Because it's not actually yours yet.
Exactly. Borrowed words cannot replace personal trust. When a foundational rule and a more attractive, skeptical explanation stand beside each other, the ultimate question the text poses is, which voice will you trust?
Which brings us right to the breaking point, I guess. The shared fall.
Yes, the climax of the scene.
So we get to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. The text says she looks at the fruit. It looks good, it's beautiful, it seems desirable for gaining wisdom. She reaches out, she eats, and she gives it to her husband.
Right.
Now, I have to stop here and push back on a massive stereotype.
Go for it.
I always see this painted in art and pop culture as Eve, wandering off completely alone, getting tricked, and ruining everything, while Adam is totally oblivious somewhere else, naming a platypus or something. Is that actually what the text says?
The text actually supports your pushback entirely, and it requires a vital correction to that cultural stereotype.
Okay, so where is he?
The original Hebrew uses a very specific word here. It's ima.
Ima.
Yes, it translates directly to with her. It places him right there in the scene, standing beside her during this entire exchange with the serpent.
Wait, standing right there.
Right there. Remember, he received the original command directly first. Yet he does not intervene. He does not refuse the fruit. He simply takes it and eats it. So this narrative is not a fable about a naive woman and an absent, innocent man. Eve was deceived by the altered narrative, yes, but Adam outright disobeyed a direct parameter. They both crossed the boundary together.
It's a shared failure. Adam was right there and just went along with it.
Completely.
And the sources point out that later in the biblical text, specifically in the letters of 1 Timothy and 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul actually uses Eve as a mirror for every human being.
Yes, he does.
He isn't using her as a warning about women being gullible. He warns that anyone's thoughts can be led away from sincere devotion, just like hers were. He is using her to show universal human vulnerability to deception.
And consider the mechanism of what Paul is doing there. He is looking at Eve as the archetype of the fragile human mind. It is a universal condition.
Right.
And look at the immediate aftermath of their choice in the Genesis text. Their eyes are opened exactly as the serpent promised, but they do not find the enlightenment or power or freedom they were looking for.
No, not at all.
In Genesis 3, verses 7 and 8, what they find is crushing shame. They sew fig leaves together to cover their bodies. They hear the sound of God walking in the garden, and their immediate instinct is to hide among the trees.
The psychological shift there is wild.
It is a profound, tragic irony. Think about it. Nothing in the physical garden had actually changed.
The trees were still the same trees.
Exactly. God was still near, just as before.
Yeah.
But their internal distorted perception turned that presence from a source of absolute joy into something they desperately felt they needed to escape.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the instinct when you fail, when you mess up spectacularly, is to hide, right?
Oh, universally.
And to throw together some kind of cover.
Yeah.
I look at those literal fig leaves they sew together, and I immediately think about modern PR spin.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think about it. Fig leaves are like a corporation issuing a non-apology after a massive scandal. The ones like, mistakes were made, we are sorry if anyone was offended.
Right, avoiding the actual issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a flimsy, superficial attempt to cover up a massive failure without actually taking responsibility. It doesn't fix the core issue at all. But God steps into this scene and essentially says, that's not going to hold up. Let me give you something real.
That transition from human hiding to the divine pursuit is the pivot point of the entire narrative. In Genesis 3, verse 9, God's very first response to their hiding isn't to hurl lightning bolts or destroy the garden.
Well,
It is a single question. Where are you? Now, make no mistake, structurally this is a question of judgment. They have crossed a boundary and have to answer for what they've done.
right, there are rules.
But simultaneously, it reveals a character who is actively moving toward hiding people. It is an initiation of pursuit, an invitation to step out of the shadows.
And when they finally step out, the blame game starts immediately. God asks Adam what happened, and Adam points at Eve. And honestly, if you read the text, he kind of points at God too.
He does, yes.
He says, the woman you gave me the fruit. He's totally passing the buck. But Eve's response is remarkably different, isn't it?
It is. In verse 13, she says, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." She names the deception, and she actually owns her action.
It's a moment of stark, unfiltered honesty.
And following that honesty, the text outlines the consequences in verses 14 through 19. And the consequences are severe pain, conflict, thorns, and ultimately mortality, death.
Yeah, Abby stuff.
The narrative makes it clear that crossing this boundary has real, unavoidable consequences. The original warning wasn't empty. However, within that very pronouncement of judgment, the text introduces a massive element of mercy.
Right, in Genesis 3, verse 15.
Yes, God gives a promise regarding the serpent and the woman. He says, "The offspring of the woman will bruise the serpent's head, even as the serpent bruises his heel."
Which is huge.
The story has barely broken apart, humanity has just failed, and already the text is declaring that the deception will not win forever. Historically, many theological sources call this the first announcement of the gospel.
And just to clarify that term for our listeners, the gospel simply means the good news of a rescue plan.
Right. It's the initial hint that a cosmic repair is coming.
It's a promise of a future right in the middle of an absolute disaster. And that leads to one of the most stunning details in the whole text.
Yeah.
In Genesis 3, verse 20, the man names his wife.
Yes.
He calls her Eve, which translates to mother of all living. But the placement of this is what blows my mind. He gives her this name after the fall.
The timing is incredible.
He names her mother of the living after the concept of death has just entered the human story.
The timeline irony there is incredibly striking. Mortality is now a reality, but the promise of life is also a reality. Notice what does not happen. The woman is not named the mother of death.
Wow, yeah.
Her profound failure is not allowed to become the final meaning of her identity. And that divine mercy continues into the physical reality in the very next verse. Genesis 3, verse 21, God makes garments of skin for Adam and Eve, and he clothes them.
Replacing the flimsy corporate PR fig leaves with something substantial.
Notice the contrast there. The text doesn't explicitly spell out every single theological detail of this act, but it clearly contrasts the fragile covering they made for themselves in fear with the durable covering provided in mercy.
Right.
Their leaves could not actually take away their shame or protect them. The garments of skin, however, naturally imply the death of an animal.
Okay.
There is a cost to this covering. Now, we shouldn't claim more than the text says. It doesn't explicitly call it a ritual sacrifice here. But it establishes a very early narrative mechanism that grows clearer throughout the rest of the historical texts.
How so? Where does that lead?
Well, it introduces the concept that true repair requires a cost. It points forward to much later texts, like John chapter 1, verse 29, where John the Baptist looks at Jesus and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
Bring it full circle.
Exactly. The underlying logic here is that grace, fundamentally, is not humanity finding a slightly better fig leaf to hide behind. Grace is a provision of what we are utterly incapable of providing for ourselves.
It's just a beautiful contrast between what we try to manufacture to save face and what is actually required to fix the brokenness.
Absolutely.
So they're covered, their shame is addressed, but the consequences haven't just vanished. They still have to leave the garden. In Genesis 3, verses 22 through 24, they are sent out of Eden, and the way back to the tree of life is guarded by flaming swords.
This specific scene represents the complex coexistence of justice and mercy.
Justice because they have to leave.
Right. It functions as justice because they cannot reject the foundational parameters of the garden and remain inside as if nothing happened. The environment is fractured, but it is also presented as a profound mercy.
I was getting kicked out of mercy.
The text suggests that God does not allow them to eat from the tree of life and live forever in a fallen, fractured, hiding condition.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
They are exiled, yes, but they do not leave empty-handed or naked. They carry the heavy clothing provided for them. They carry the promise of the offspring who will crush the serpent. And they carry the name Eve, a name forever tethered to life, not death.
And we see evidence of that hope immediately in the very next chapter, Genesis 4, verse 1. Outside Eden, in the harsh reality of the real world, Eve gives birth to Cain, and she says, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord."
She still has faith.
Yeah, even outside the garden, having lost paradise, she still recognizes the Creator as the giver of life. She isn't totally alienated, That relationship, though deeply damaged, still exists. She is still trusting that voice.
And that continued trust threads directly into the larger biblical arc that the sources trace. The narrative of Genesis sets up a problem that takes the rest of the texts to resolve. We see this in the later writings of Paul.
Right.
For instance, in his letter to the Galatians, he talks about the ultimate rescuer being born of woman, linking right back to that promise in Genesis 3. In 1 Corinthians, Paul actually calls Jesus the last Adam.
Let's unpack that last Adam concept, because that can sound like inside baseball theology if you aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
Think of it as a cosmic reset button.
Okay.
The logic Paul is using is one of representation. The first Adam was the representative of humanity in the garden. He faced a test of trust, he failed, he crossed the boundary, and he hid in shame.
Right.
Paul argues in Romans chapter 5 that a new representative had to come and do the exact opposite to balance the scales. This is often referred to as justification, meaning making things completely right and balanced again.
So where the first representative failed, the new one has to succeed under the exact same pressure.
Exactly that mechanism. When Jesus faced intense temptation, as recorded in Matthew chapter 4, it was in a desert, a wasteland, the opposite of a lush garden.
Oh, interesting contrast.
Right. And when the tempter came to him, twisting words and trying to plant suspicion about God's heart, Jesus didn't rely on borrowed, half-remembered rules. He answered directly with the actual text of Scripture. He trusted the Father's heart completely.
He didn't let the narrative get reframed.
Precisely. And crucially, when he carried the ultimate weight of human failure, he did not hide.
He didn't sow any fig leaves. He carried the guilt and shame without making excuses or passing the blame to someone else.
Yes.
And that massive narrative arc eventually resolves at the very end of the biblical texts. In Revelation chapter 22, the tree of life finally returns.
It brings it all back together.
The text says the curse is gone. That road that was guarded by flaming swords all the way back in Genesis is opened back up. Not because humanity figured out how to sneak past the guards, but through the ultimate provision of grace.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a profound underlying logic about how these texts view the divine character.
Which is?
God does not use the worst moment of a person's life to write the complete meaning of their existence. The story of Eve, when stripped of the caricatures, answers a fundamental question.
Right.
When human beings fail, when they are caught hiding behind something flimsy they made to cover their own shame, what does the Creator do? He comes near. He asks the questions that invite them into the light. He tells the truth about the consequences. He remains perfectly just. And at great cost, he makes a way back to life.
So what does this all mean? For you listening right now, taking this all in, it means that the image of the first woman being deceived is not the final sentence Scripture gives us about Eve. Her worst moment didn't become the final meaning of her name.
No, it didn't.
She wasn't branded the mother of death forever. She was named mother of the living. This isn't just some simplistic, two-dimensional fable about a talking snake and a shiny apple that you learned when you were 5.
Definitely not.
It's an intricate, deeply psychological text about a God who actively seeks, fairly judges, mercifully covers, and ultimately saves.
It really challenges the reader to reevaluate how they approach these ancient texts. When we strip away the centuries of cultural assumptions and look closely at the actual mechanics of the story, the words used, the sequence of generosity before restriction, we find a narrative that is far more honest about human frailty.
And far more expansive in its view of mercy than we usually give it credit for.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with something really important to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. We mentioned earlier that God's very first response to human failure, before any judgments were handed down, before any punishments were spoken, was a single question: where are you?
Pursuit.
Exactly. So think about the questions you ask yourself when you fail or make a mistake. Are they questions that simply condemn you? Do they force you to hide in shame behind your own flimsy fig leaves, your excuses, your deflections, your PR spin?
That's a powerful question.
Or can you learn to ask yourself questions that actively pursue you, that bring you out of hiding and lead you toward genuine repair? Think about that the next time you find yourself wanting to hide from a mistake. Because just like that famous painting we talked about at the beginning, once you wipe away the centuries of hype and assumption, what is actually on the canvas is so much more beautiful and so much more merciful than you ever thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
This is not who we thought they were. A quiet series where Scripture asks us to look again, not at the label, but at the person. And next time, we will take a second look at another person we may have misread.